All right, so this week our topic is environmental justice and disability. And what you're seeing there in the cover photo is a elderly care facility that was destroyed during the Camp Fire in California a couple years ago. And luckily those wheelchairs in the photo were in storage at the time the fire came through, not in use. But one of the things we're going to talk about in this lesson is the way that disabled people are often much more vulnerable to environmental hazards like a wildfire. Okay, so our overview here is we're going to start by talking about what is disability justice, right? What kind of justice issues do we have to pay attention to with respect to people with disabilities? Then we're going to talk about the interconnections between disabilities and the environment, and then wrap up by looking at the connections between disabilities and environmentalism, right? The things that we might do to try to protect our environment, how might those impact disabled people? So to start off, one of the sort of distinguishing features of disability as compared to a lot of other axes of inequality that we might look at is that anyone could become disabled at any point. All right, something could happen to you that would lead you to become disabled, and if you live long enough, you probably will become disabled. Old age is a major cause of a variety of different kinds of disabilities, and so, in contrast to, say, race, right? You're not going to change your race during your lifetime, right? Nothing can suddenly make you end up a different race than you were. But with disability, lots of people become disabled during their life. And as I said, most people, if you live long enough and to become elderly, you'll probably become disabled in one way or another. And so you'll sometimes see people using the expression temporarily able-bodied. Right? So there are the people that are disabled, and there are people that are not yet disabled because it's something that could happen to you down the line at some point. Another important thing to keep in mind when we talk about disability is that there's a wide variety of disabilities that are going to affect people's lives in very different ways. And so the experience of being blind is not the same as the experience of being autistic or the experience of having cerebral palsy or any of the other things that might fall under this broad umbrella of disability. So sometimes the things that we might say in general about disability might not apply in specific circumstances, or ideas about disability that are developed by someone who's focusing on one sort of disability might not apply in the same way to a different one. So we want to keep that the diversity and variety of possible disabilities in mind. And many of these disabilities are invisible. You can't always tell just from looking at someone or talking to someone what disabilities that they might have. And a lot of people who have disabilities are also very good at temporarily masking those disabilities, because you can face a lot of negative treatment from other people if they perceive you as disabled. So, especially if you're only interacting with someone for a short period of time, they may be able to kind of hide the disabilities they have. So you don't always know what everyone around you, what kind of condition they're dealing with. And the reason that people would make efforts to hide a disability if they can is that there's a lot of social stigma attached to disability. And so that means that a person may face barriers both from the sort of directly from the disability itself, and then also on top of that, barriers from the social stigma, right? So if there's somebody that uses a cane to walk, for example, they might have these sort of direct barriers to their life in terms of things like, lots of stairs that they have to go up and down that are hard to navigate with a cane, or an expectation that they can get from point A to point B in a certain amount of time that's unrealistic because they walk slower or something like that. Right? There's sort of direct barriers, but then there's also the sort of indirect kinds of things where people who see somebody walking with a cane might be uncomfortable around that person and might try to avoid that person, or on the other hand might be sort of condescending to that person or assume that they can't do things, or kind of treat them in like an infantilized kind of way. So there's the social stigma attached to disability in addition to the sort of direct effects of the actual condition that a person has. And then the last note on this slide is that you'll sometimes run into people, usually well-meaning non-disabled allies, who promote this idea that we should use so-called person-first language, so that we should say, you know, a person who is blind rather than blind person, or person with autism rather than autistic person. And so the thing is that, you know, obviously with any specific individual that you might be talking about, use the terminology that that individual would want to use to describe themselves. But in general, most disabled people don't see a need for this person-first language, and may even reject that. They say, you know, my disability is part of who I am. I'd be a different person if I didn't have this disability. So I don't need people to, you know, try to euphemize it or you know, detach it by making this effort to use this person-first language. So throughout this lesson, I'm not going to worry about this person-first language thing. It's a thing that seems to be mostly non-disabled people who think they're helping out by promoting this idea. Okay, so now let's talk about some models of disability. That is, what is disability? How does disability work? What does it mean to be disabled? And there's two major models that get discussed when we're talking about disability. So the first one is the so-called medical model. So in the medical model, we think of disability as something that arises from a flaw or a shortcoming in someone's mind or body. The person essentially has something wrong with them, that there's sort of a norm, you know, what a person's mind and body should be, and people who deviate from that norm, they're lacking something, they have a hindrance to them, they don't meet up to that standard. That's what it means to be disabled. And so this is by far the most prevalent model in our society, and lots of people just sort of adopt this model implicitly in their thinking without even necessarily realizing it. And so if you're working on this medical model, then the way to address disability, right, if people are having problems in life because of being disabled, the solution is to fix the person. So the problem is that you can't walk, so we're going to do something to make it so that you can walk. The problem is that your brain doesn't produce enough of X or Y chemical, so we're going to give you some pills so you get that chemical in your brain, or you know, whatever the specific condition is. All right, so people have these, you know, they're flawed or broken in some way. They don't match up to the expectation of what a person should be, and so we got to fix the person. That's the medical model. Contrasting with that, we have the social model of disability. And so according to the social model, disability arises from a mismatch between a person's mind or body and the demands of their environment. So the environment that you're in, both the social and physical environment, requires you to do certain things that are not compatible with what your mind or body are capable of. Right, so it's this mismatch between a person and an environment that creates the disability. So then that means that you could address the disability by changing the environment. If you change the environment so that it no longer requires something from someone that they can't do, they're no longer going to experience disability. Right? They're no longer going to be held back from being able to function and participate in their world, because now their environment is compatible with themselves. And so that also means that changing the environment can also create disability where it might not have existed before. Right? If you change the environment to something that starts making demands that certain people can't meet up with, then you're going to essentially create disability for them. And so one way to think about that I like to use when I'm teaching in person is to think about the chairs that are in a typical college classroom. Those chairs are built on the assumption that people's bodies are a certain size. And so if you think of height, for example, right, those chairs are designed to accommodate people who are roughly 5 to 6 feet tall. Right? And that's the most common range of heights for college students. So we build the desks to to work for people those heights, but then that means that someone who is of a very different height, right, someone who's 8 feet tall or someone who's 3 feet tall, aren't going to be able to use those desks very easily. So they're going to be disabled by the mismatch between the size of their body and the type of desks that are available to them. And if we were to get that person a desk that suits them, then they would no longer be experiencing that problem from having the mismatched desk. And if we made all the desks, say we filled the whole room with desks that were designed for a 3-foot tall person, then all of the people who are 5 to 6 feet tall, who could fit easily into the original desks, would now experience a disability kind of situation because they'd be trying to use a desk that is not suited for them. And probably some of you have actually probably experienced something like that if you've ever tried to sit down in like a kindergarten classroom or a nursery, right? It was an environment where we do make the furniture for people of a very different size than the typical adult. So we can address disability by changing the environment, not just by changing the person. This also leads to the implication that the various conditions that we label as disabilities aren't inherently bad or deviant or something wrong with them. They're just not well accommodated by the environment, right? The problem is the unaccommodating environment. It's not that there's something wrong inherently with having this condition, and so therefore we shouldn't be focusing on eliminating these kinds of conditions. And then to take it one step further, and let me move my face out of the way. Where's my pointer? Hang on. There. Sorry, having mouse problems. That then leads us to the idea that we can think of disability as a form of diversity. So we want a society that is diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, a society that's diverse in terms of gender, diverse in terms of religion, all these kind of things, right? We have this idea that, the ideal is not to, make everybody the same race. The ideal is to accept all the different races of humans as equal, right? And as valuable parts of the diversity of humanity. Well, we can apply that same kind of idea to disability, that the different sorts of minds and bodies that people have are a form of diversity in the world that we should accept. And so I've got 2 examples there of specific areas where this idea is really being pushed by certain groups of people. So you have the neurodiversity movement, and so this is something that originated in autistic communities, and the idea applies to other mental conditions as well. And the idea there is that the autistic way of thinking is equally valid, and it's equally equally good way of seeing the world as a non-autistic way of thinking. And that autism only seems to be a problem because we live in a society that is structured on the assumptions of the non-autistic brain, and we try to force autistic people to fit into that society that's not designed for them. But in fact, an autistic way of thinking is a good thing. It's a valuable thing. It's a thing that autistic people will like about themselves. And so we should accept that as part of the diversity of human experience rather than seeing it as a problem that needs to be done away with. And you can find scenarios in which being autistic is actually an advantage to a person. So, for example, I had a autistic coworker when I worked at a newspaper, and he was one of the copy editors, and he was a really good copy editor because one of his autistic people talk about having special interests, like specific topics that they get really focused on learning all the little details of. And so one of this guy's special interests was grammar and the Associated Press style book, and so he was really good at copy editing stuff for the newspaper. He caught things that I didn't, as a non-autistic person, stuff that I didn't notice was, out of compliance with the style book and so forth. So the neurodiversity movement is this idea that these different ways of thinking are equally valid, equally valuable, and should all be accepted as part of the diversity of society. The other example that I've got there on the slide is deaf culture. And you'll see I spelled deaf with a capital D. And when people use a capital D for deaf, they're referring to it as a cultural group, not just as, people who can't hear. And so there is a whole culture to being deaf, right? Deaf people have their own language, sign language. And among deaf people, a lot of people say that this is a valid culture, part of the cultural diversity of our society, and our goal shouldn't be to eliminate deafness and to assimilate deaf people into hearing society, whether by finding ways that they can live as if they were hearing, or even by medically curing deafness so that everybody can in fact hear. But in fact, that deaf culture is a valid culture of its own for people to participate in. So those are two examples where people have really advanced this idea of disability as a form of diversity rather than as a problem that needs to be fixed or eliminated. But then the last point that I've got on there, and that takes us back to the thing that I said on the first slide, that there's a lot of different sorts of disabilities that are experienced differently by different sorts of people. Not all disabilities fit easily into that diversity model. So if you take something like a chronic pain condition, you'll find it hard to find someone that says, chronic pain is just a part of human diversity and we should, not want to eliminate it, right? Most people with a chronic pain condition would say, I'd love it if we could get rid of chronic pain, if nobody ever had to experience the kind of pain that I've had to deal with. So not all disabilities fit as neatly into the diversity model, but even with something like chronic pain, you can still apply this social model more generally, because the problems faced by a person experiencing chronic pain are not just the direct experience of pain, my feet hurt and that's bad. It's also the fact that they may have trouble getting or keeping a job because their job doesn't allow them to sit down. If you're a grocery store cashier, for example, it doesn't actually make it any harder for you to do your job if you sit down, but a lot of places don't allow you to have a chair. So that would mean somebody that has chronic pain that's exacerbated by standing up for a long period of time wouldn't be able to maintain a job. So the lack of accommodation to that disability, right? The fact that the environment makes demands to stand up for long periods of time that are incompatible with the condition of your body is an additional problem, beyond just the experience of the pain itself. Having mouse problems today. There we go. Okay, so then let's talk now about the idea of justice for disabled people. So one of the key concepts to keep in mind here is there's a slogan that came out of disability movements that's nothing about us without us. So the idea here is that disabled people are very often treated paternalistically by non-disabled people. So people without disabilities think that they know what disabled people need and will do things that they think are good for disabled people without actually consulting the people that they are trying to help. And it's often tied into this idea that disabled people are in some ways, kind of quasi-children, right? And that gets back to the real literal meaning of the term paternalistic, right? That's treating someone like you are their parent or their father. And that's a big problem for people who are adults with disabilities being treated in this kind of childlike way. And so you get this slogan to remind people that the things that are done in the interests of helping disabled people should really come from the agenda set by those disabled people themselves, that disabled people should be the ones deciding what they need from society. So a couple notes about this. So one is, if you put this in the context of some of the concepts from earlier in the class, this is really a claim about procedural justice. This is the idea that for for things that are done to help disabled people to be just, they need to be done with the input and the agenda setting of disabled people themselves. So this is a procedural issue being raised here. And then second point there is just an illustration of this concept. So you may have heard of the organization Autism Speaks. It's kind of the largest charity organization dealing with autism. And that organization has come in for a lot of criticism from autistic people because it's an organization that is primarily focused on the needs and perspectives of parents and other caregivers for autistic children. It's not an organization that is primarily run by or advancing the perspective of people who actually have autism. And so the activities that Autism Speaks does and the agendas that they have don't match up with what autistic people necessarily want for themselves. So for example, they're very focused on the idea of doing medical research to find a cure for autism so that, you know, people won't be born autistic anymore. Whereas, you know, if you think back to that idea of neurodiversity that I talked about in an earlier slide, and a lot of autistic people say, no, there's nothing wrong with being autistic. The only problem is that society doesn't accept that as a valid way to be. And so the whole agenda that this organization has is going against the interests of the people that they supposedly are trying to help. And so, you know, to see a contrasting example, right, of what an organization might look like if it was run by and you know, guided by the perspectives of people who actually are autistic. You have a group like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So that's a sort of rival national organization that is run by autistic adults, that focusing on what they think is important for autistic people, like more acceptance within society of the autistic way of thinking and being in the world. So in terms of, you know, what disability justice advocates are looking for, you know, I kind of got into this in talking about the contrast between these two autism organizations, as this rather than looking for a cure, rather than looking to eliminate disability from society, the argument is for a society that embraces disabled people, a society that accepts disability as part of the human condition and makes it possible for people with disabilities to participate fully in society, rather than hoping to essentially cure or get rid of people who are disabled. You also have a concern for interdependence rather than independence. So a lot of the disabling aspects of the environment, right? If we're thinking about our social model of disability and the way that the environment makes demands of people that they can't meet, a lot of those demands that create problems for disabled people have to do with our culture's value of independence. We have this ideal that everyone should be able to take care of all their own wants and needs and not need any help from any other person. So that's a very powerful cultural value in Western culture and American culture in particular. It's the ideal of independence. That is not an achievable ideal really for anybody. You know, complete independence, never needing any sort of help from any other person, that's not really realistic. But you can kind of pretend if you are not disabled, right? You can kind of pretend that you're close to this ideal of total independence, whereas a lot of people with disabilities find that ideal of independence is very clearly off the table for them. And so rather than a society that holds up this ideal that nobody can fully meet and large sectors of society are excluded from and definitely can't even aspire to, instead, maybe we should have a society that's organized around the idea of interdependence, that all people depend in various ways on other people, and that we can recognize that, we can value that interdependence, we can have a broad and far-reaching web of interdependence where you are supported by a wide range of different people in your life, rather than trying to do everything on your own or having just, one or two people that you lean on for support. And so you can kind of see this if you look at the typical organization of a family, right? Families are one of the sets of people that you would often rely on for help of various sorts. The typical family in a modern Western culture is absurdly small as compared to most of human cultures for most of our existence on this planet. The typical American family, is just a few people, right? It might be, in a lot of cases, just you and one other person if you have a romantic partner and no children. Whereas for most of human history, most people have lived in very extended families where you had this wide web of people that you were supporting and they were supporting you. And that the claim being made then within this disability justice framework is that that's a healthier and more functional way to organize society, rather than expecting this total independence from everybody and therefore leaving a bunch of people behind. And then another important point in disability justice is to avoid setting up a conflict between the rights of caretakers and the rights of the disabled people that they're caring for. So a lot of disabled people need some sort of a caretaker to deal with certain tasks in their life, right? They might need someone to help them, get in and out of their wheelchair, to take a bath, to do chores around the house that they can't easily do, etc. So a lot of, and that kind of is part of where we get to that idea of interdependence, right? That a lot of disabled people very clearly need another person to help them out with a whole bunch of things. And the things that people with disabilities are asking for to be better able to participate in society are sometimes rejected on the grounds that they are this added burden to caretakers. Right? And if you think again about organizations like Autism Speaks, that's often where they're coming at it from, is the idea that raising an autistic child is just this huge burden to the parents, and so that's why we need to cure autism, so nobody has to go through this big burden of raising the child with these special needs and stuff. So people will often try to create this conflict that, well, we can't do X, Y, or Z for disabled people because that's too much of a burden on the caretakers that they depend on. But we can, on the one hand, recognize that care work, that is, it's work, and it's often unpaid or underpaid. It often falls on people who are from marginalized groups. So whether that's, women, if it's sort of unpaid family caretaking work, that more often falls to women than men, or if you're looking at, paid aides and stuff that are making usually not very much money, it would be disproportionately, people of color and other marginalized groups, but their interests don't necessarily have to conflict with the interests of disabled people if we think on the broader social level, right? If we have a society that's set up to support people in a variety of ways, then we don't have to expect, a single caretaker to shoulder all of the work that might be needed to help a person in a certain situation, right? That work is spread out and shared through the broader society. And so from that point of view, the interests of disabled people and caretakers would come together rather than being in conflict with each other. Okay, so now let's bring the environment more explicitly into what we're talking about here. So there's a lot of different kinds of environmental hazards, environmental problems that are going to impact disabled people more than people who are not disabled. They're going to be additionally vulnerable to a variety of sorts of hazards. And so one dimension to this is simply the fact that disabled people are much more likely to live in poverty than people who are not disabled. And so if you have less economic resources, that is going to, lead to a lot of environmental problems, that you can't live in an area that is as ideal, so you end up living in a polluted area, living in an area that's vulnerable to floods, etc. You can't afford to, purchase good insurance. You can't afford to rebuild after something happens. You can't easily afford medical care for the consequences of some sort of environmental hazard, right? So there's all these reasons that poverty is going to make people more vulnerable to environmental problems, and disabled people are much more likely to live in poverty than people who aren't disabled. And part of this is because workplaces don't fully accommodate a lot of disabilities. I used the example earlier of someone who can't stand for long periods of time, that wouldn't be able to work at a grocery store that insists the cashiers have to stand all the time, even though you could still do the job just fine sitting in a chair. Difficulties getting and keeping a job, difficulties getting promoted if the job isn't accommodating to you, so your performance indicators don't end up being as high as your non-disabled colleagues, etc. And then for people who can't work a full-time job at all, and who rely on some sort of government assistance, there are strict limits on the amount of income that you can get and the amount of assets that you can have, right? How much money can you have in your savings account? If you go over a certain amount, then you can get kicked off of those benefits. So they essentially lock people into poverty. You're not allowed to get out of poverty, or you lose some of the benefits that you may rely on. And so if getting out of poverty doesn't sort of vault you up to a high enough level of income that you can easily make up for all those things, right? Because it's not just income assistance, there's also things like, medical insurance and so forth that you would lose. Then you're kind of stuck in this situation of poverty. You also have exceptions to minimum wage laws for companies that hire some disabled people. So for example, intellectually disabled people will be allowed to work for something lower than minimum wage, with the idea that this is somehow some sort of charity to them to give them a job. But then that means that they're not earning very much money, and they're going to be in poverty. They're not going to have the assets, the resources to help them when some sort of environmental problem affects them. For a lot of different kinds of disabilities, you have difficulty with evacuating if there's an acute environmental hazard, the hurricanes coming through, or wildfires coming through, or something. So obviously if you have a mobility impairment, if you're a wheelchair user or something, it's more difficult for you to evacuate in the face of some sort of hazard that's approaching. You may also have issues with access to information. Right? So if all of the warnings about the hazard are being transmitted via the radio, for example, then someone who is deaf is not going to get those warnings. The information's not going to get across to them. They're not going to know that they need to get out of there. And you also you think back to that idea of stigma against disabled people. That can often limit a disabled person's social circle, because other people don't want to be friends with them or have relationships with them. And so then information very often passes along those social networks, and so that can cut people off from knowing what's going on with some sort of environmental hazard. There's a lot of medical conditions that can be tied into somebody's disability that are exacerbated by something like pollution or climate change. So for example, if you have a respiratory issue, then that is going to be exacerbated by air pollution, whether that's smoke from a factory, smoke from a wildfire, something like that. So those medical conditions can make people more vulnerable to some of the different sorts of impacts that environmental problems have on people. And then the last thing to note there is that environmental hazards can actually cause disability. So many conditions that somebody might actually have an environmental cause. And so one of the notable examples is asthma. So asthma can be a disabling condition, and it can be caused by environmental conditions. If you have air pollution, especially when you're very young, it can create asthma. And so there have been studies showing that people of color have much higher rates of asthma than white people, and that is directly linked to the worse air quality in neighborhoods of color as compared to white neighborhoods. So that environmental racism that we talked about earlier in the class, one of the effects of that is to cause higher rates of asthma among people of color. Okay, so then moving on now to talk about the experiences of disabled people in engaging with nature. So here we're tying in our discussions of access to outdoor recreation as a dimension of the environment. So first and most simply, disabled people often lack access to natural spaces. So if the trail system in a nature reserve is one that somebody with a wheelchair can't navigate, for example, then those folks aren't going to get the benefits of enjoying that natural area. So there are a variety of ways that inequalities that impact disabled people can limit their access to nature, to natural spaces. We also have this ideal in our society, and that's very tied in to being outdoors, outdoor recreation stuff, of this rugged physical fitness, right? Our ideal of somebody that can run up a mountain and punch a bear. That's what people aspire to. That's what people see as appropriate to being in the outdoors. And so that ideal can discourage disabled people who know that they can't match up to that ideal, right? Know that they aren't ever going to be that bear punching person. Discourage them from getting involved in outdoor recreation, and if they do decide to try to partake, it can lead to stigma from other people that see them as not belonging there, or as not living up to the standards that we expect from a true outdoors person. And you don't see people with disabilities represented in media about the outdoors. So similar to the studies that I talked about the representation of Black people in media about the outdoors, you could do a similar thing, and you'd find a lack of representation of people with disabilities in media about the outdoors. And then an additional issue that can confront disabled people is criticism of reliance on so-called unnatural assistive devices or medication. So a lot of people manage their disability by using technology, by using high-tech assistive devices, by using a variety of kinds of medications that they take to manage their whatever condition that they have. And there's a idea that circulates in our society that that's bad, that you should try to avoid relying on technology if you can, that it's unnatural to need to take a bunch of pills every day, for example. And as an illustration, you may have seen this meme that I've got on the screen there, or something similar, making a similar kind of claim. So you've got this picture of this sort of little hiking trail through these beautiful mountains that's labeled "This is an antidepressant," and then underneath it you've got a picture of a whole bunch of pills labeled "This is shit." So the implication of this meme is that if you got out in nature and experienced nature, you wouldn't need all those pills. That taking those pills is a bad thing. It's a less worthy substitute for getting out in nature, and that would cure your depression if you did that. So this sets up kind of two problems for someone who is depressed. On the one hand, it is a criticism of them and the way that they're managing their condition, right? It's knocking a medical intervention that may be very successful in a particular person's case, right? Those pills may work very well for someone, and it's implying that they shouldn't be doing it. It's also, in effect, kind of blaming people for their situation. That, well, if you just got out in nature more and experienced, these beautiful mountains or whatever, then you wouldn't be depressed. And so I don't need to have any sympathy for your depression because you brought it on yourself by not taking care of yourself properly. That's, a harmful narrative for disabled people, and also, simply not true. That, people don't cause their own conditions in that way, and people can't simply, will themselves out of having a disability, or, take a hike and get over being depressed. So the rhetorical uses of nature within our culture can create these additional problems for disabled people. And so then the final thing that I want to talk about is conflicts between environmentalism, so movements aiming to protect the environment, and the needs and rights of disabled people. So one of the major areas that this comes up is the fact that disabled people may rely a lot on products that environmentalists have criticized for being wasteful or polluting or bad for the environment in various ways. And so I've got some examples there in the sub-bullets. So a lot of times people with disabilities need to use a lot of medical supplies that are single-use or disposable, various kinds of syringes and wipes and bandages and other sorts of things. And you can generate a good bit of trash out of that, right? All of the wrappers and the used items and everything can generate a good bit of solid waste. And so the environmentalist narrative that all that waste is bad, you've got the people that try to live this waste-free lifestyle, and go an entire year without using anything packaged and all those kinds of things. Well, that's just not something that is feasible or possible for a lot of disabled people, because they may need a lot of those disposable supplies to, address a medical condition and do so in a safe and hygienic kind of way. You've got delivery services, which sometimes are criticized for the amount of, fuel that's used to deliver stuff to people, and the amount of packaging that goes into it. I've seen people becoming concerned about the rise in takeout orders during the coronavirus pandemic, right? Because it's generating additional waste because they're being brought to you in disposable plastic containers rather than the washable, reusable plates that you'd get if you ate out at a restaurant. But a lot of disabled people may rely on those kind of things, right? It's not just a luxury to order Chinese food. It may be the only way that you can get things that you need, because you're not able to cook for yourself all the time, or you're not able to easily leave your house to go shopping yourself, and so you need to get stuff delivered. So those services, make a lot of things more possible for certain disabled people, even though environmentalists may criticize them for being, wasteful and polluting. You've got prepackaged foods. So, one of the sort of classic examples, you go into the grocery store and you want an orange, you could buy, a whole orange that comes with no artificial packaging because it's in its own, peel. Or over on the nearby shelf, right, you'll find plastic package that contains pre-peeled orange segments, and you'll see people saying, "Oh, that's so wasteful. Oranges come in their own package already. Why does somebody need to buy this pre-peeled thing that's in this artificial plastic container that's just going to become trash?" Well, a variety of people will buy those, right? And some people may simply be, too lazy to cut open an orange, but other people may be in a situation where, because of a disability, they can't just peel an orange, right? Opening that plastic container is a lot easier than peeling the peel off of an orange. So if you, for example, have arthritis, the pre-peeled ones may be the only way that you're going to get to eat an orange. And then the last note that I've got there is temperature control. So a very common, thing you can do to help the environment that you see often is to adjust your thermostat, to let your house be colder in the winter so you don't use up as much energy on heating, and let your house get warmer in the summer so you don't use up so much energy on air conditioning. And, so it's a very prevalent idea of what you should do, for environmentalism. But for some disabled people, they may have a very narrow tolerance for temperatures, that their body may start to have a lot of negative reactions if it dips a little too cold or gets a little too hot. So they may need to keep their temperature control in a very narrow band, even if that means using up a lot more energy than they would have if they, let it go a few degrees to either side, depending on the season. So you've got these conflicts between what disabled people need to be able to be a fully participating member of their society, and some of the things that environmentalists have said that we should do to protect the environment. And so this becomes a major problem when these go from being like, here's a list of tips for you to voluntarily try for saving the earth, into being an actual law or regulation that's meant to stop people from doing these environmentally wasteful things. And if you have a blunt or overbroad environmental rule, you can actually do real harm to disabled people by taking away access to services and products that they may depend on. And so we're going to dig into that in more depth by looking at the issue of plastic straw bans. So that is your case study readings for this week. You're going to look at the impacts that efforts to ban plastic straws have had on disabled people who may depend on plastic straws to be able to drink, that they're not able to drink, lift the glass up style drink, and alternative materials for straws may also not be adequate, may not meet the needs of some people. So they need plastic straws, but there are these laws passed in a variety of places that are trying to ban or eliminate them in the interest of reducing disposable plastics and the pollution that results from that. So we're going to talk in more detail about that in our live sessions. So I will end things there and see you in class.